My name is Marіки Stadnik, and on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Toronto branch, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us tonight for this special presentation, The Counter-Offensive in Ukraine, a discussion with Tim Mack. I would also at this time like to acknowledge and thank our partners for their invaluable assistance and support in planning this event, the Pетра Яцика program and the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. When Russia illegally invaded and attacked Ukraine in February of 2022, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, together with all freedom-loving peoples in the world, was called to action. For the past 2 years and 2 months, or 775 days, as a community, we have actively supported Ukraine in their struggle against a foreign aggressor through various initiatives. Please visit our website for more information about our ongoing Stand With Ukraine campaign. In addition, we've assisted thousands of Ukrainian war refugees and displaced persons seeking refuge from the war here in the GTA. Likewise, our presenter tonight has also been engaged in fighting oppression and tyranny by bringing to light barbaric acts of war through his direct reporting from Ukrainian front lines. Tim Mack is the founder of The Counteroffensive, a twice-weekly journalism publication that focuses on deeply reported human interest stories to tell news of the war in Ukraine. He's a former correspondent for NPR, The Daily Beast, and Politico. He's also the author of a book on the inner workings of the National Rifle Association called Misfire, which has been optioned for use in a feature film. Uniquely, Tim Mack also has a military background. He's a former U.S. Army combat medic, having served as a soldier in the West Virginia Army National Guard for 5 years. Much of the news coverage today focuses on human beings as merely a force that war and violence act upon, rather than individuals with profound backgrounds that happen to be in the news. The counteroffensive's unique perspective puts human stories front and center by telling you not just what happened today, but also about the people who experienced it, exploring more deeply what their lives are like. With a team headquartered in Kyiv, Tim's goal is to tell the personal stories of people threatened by authoritarianism in Ukraine and occasionally elsewhere around the world as well. Tim's team covers the war in Ukraine not merely as a site of conflict, but as regions with deep historical, cultural, and linguistic traditions. In other words, a more holistic approach to war correspondence. Tim and the counteroffensive team believe that when stories of those oppressed by dictatorship are told in a compelling way, readers will find the injustice of it all, demands change, and requires a righting. That's R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G. Through deep reporting and downright tenacity, Tim was able to track down the notorious Russian 53rd Anti-Missile Brigade, known for its role in shooting down MH17 and the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. He also spent 10 months investigating a single war crime, the killing of a man in a small town 50 kilometers east of Kyiv named Novobasan. The counteroffensive, which was launched in the spring of 2023 ahead of a much-anticipated Ukrainian campaign that season, draws from that moment a determination and hopefulness about the progress a free people can achieve, and uses that inspiration as journalistic fuel. The name counteroffensive is meant to signify a broader campaign against apathy, cynicism, and ignorance about world events. We are pleased to have Tim with us tonight and very much looking forward to his presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Toronto branch and the Munk School for hosting this event today. You might be wondering, who is this guy standing up at the front of the stage? Well, I'm Tim. I'm a Canadian. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia. I went to school at McGill University. That seems a world away. I graduated back in 2008. In the time after that, I worked for a man whose name actually has a lot more significance in this room than in most rooms that I present in. I worked for Maxime Bernier back in 2008, and you may remember that in the summer of 2008 he had something of a scandal in which he had to resign in disgrace. And so I like to joke that I was exiled to the United States after that. I moved to Washington, D.C. for what seemed to be a 4-month stint, working for another man whose name has some meaning here in Toronto, David Fromm. I worked for him starting in 2009. And he was starting a website then covering American politics. And he said, hey, do you want to be a reporter? And I said, okay. I didn't really have many other options. And 15 years later, I'm still a journalist, still a reporter. During that period, I worked for a number of major news organizations like Politico, the Daily Beast, the Washington Examiner, and National Public Radio, NPR. I took a little bit of a break in between to join the U.S. Army. I like to joke that that I left journalism and joined the Army for increase in my work-life balance. But a lot of people ask me, why did you join the Army? You had already been in journalism for about a decade. And I kind of tell them, well, 2016, I'd covered the U.S. presidential campaign really closely. And it really felt like the world was ending with the election of Donald Trump. And I was thinking, in a zombie apocalypse, no one ever is like, I need a journalist right now. I wanted to, to learn something. I wanted to do something with my hands and learn how to do something with my hands. And so I became a soldier and started learning about emergency medicine. And just as it would have it, the pandemic broke out, and those skills happened to be very useful. In 2022, I just left the military and had been working for NPR as a correspondent, as their lead investigative political correspondent in Washington, D.C. And there were these, I'm sure you'll remember, these warnings from the U.S. intelligence community and from many other intelligence communities in the West, saying that Putin was up to something, and it could be big. And then later on that he was intending to invade Ukraine. I know that many Ukrainians and many folks with Ukrainian backgrounds were skeptical of this at the time. Many people who live in Kyiv now, when you talk to them, they'll say that they didn't think that it would ever happen to the degree that it ultimately did. Because of my medical background and my military background, I was tapped to be part of the team that NPR sent to Ukraine in case a war broke out. And as luck or lack of luck would have it, I landed in Kyiv the night the invasion began, just hours before the full-scale invasion broke out. And I remember experiencing a sense of shock that I'm sure many people in Kyiv and many people in Ukraine and many people in the Ukrainian diaspora and many people elsewhere in the world, Ukrainian or not, felt that morning, which is a sense of total shock and a sense of what can be done next to push back against this wave of authoritarianism. For me, that shock took the form of getting a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning and my editor saying, something is happening outside, you better get downstairs. And I remember being in such a state of shock that I did the only thing that I normally would do when I woke up in the morning, which is I went to the mirror and I started brushing my teeth. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what was next. But what led from that was a long period of reporting in Ukraine, including a number of war crimes investigations and a lot of reporting more holistically, as was mentioned in the introduction, about what the war is like. What I found is that the stories that I wrote about Ukraine did fine, but what people were hungry for was the behind-the-scenes coverage. Things as simple as the dogs that we saw in Ukraine as we covered the conflict. People wanted to connect with those on the ground who were experiencing the war. They didn't just want to hear this happened today or that happened today. Fighting happened in this village you hadn't heard of, and it moved to another village you hadn't heard of. They wanted to connect in ways that traditional news media hasn't been, and I consider myself part of that in many ways, hasn't been very effective in doing. So in May of last year, I went back to Ukraine and started my own company called The Counteroffensive. And as drawing on some of the journalism that we had done early in the full-scale invasion, we developed a philosophy about what kind of journalism we would do and what would actually be differentiated and different and valuable to people. And what we came up with was an idea that's encapsulated in our slogan, which is that empathy and authoritarianism can't mix. And what I mean by that is that when you tell human stories of people suffering from the impacts of autocracy, of Putin's invasion, but not only Putin's invasion, but this rise of authoritarianism that we see all across the world and that threatens not only Ukraine, but places like Taiwan, and threatens us here in Canada and Americans and all freedom-loving people, people who want to take charge of their own destinies. When you tell these personal stories, people thousands of miles away connect on a deeper level and are inspired to do something about it. It's not merely enough to learn about what's happening in Ukraine. It requires action and it requires inspiration. And so what we've tried to do is cover Ukraine as more than just a place where violence happens to be occurring, but a place where there is a unique sense of culture and identity, language and cuisine. A lot of people ask me, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about Ukraine over the last 2 years? And they expect me to say something about armored vehicles or missiles or the front lines. And I happen to say something that may be sacrilegious to the folks in this room. And that is that what I've learned and discovered over the last 2 years is that borscht is actually not the national food of Ukraine. It's actually sushi. It's actually the Philadelphia roll. Ukrainians have a deep and abiding love for putting cream cheese in with their raw fish. I can't say that I endorse it, but it's something that I've seen and I've come to have a soft spot for. I'm working on a story about this particular topic right now, so I'm glad that I'm able to test it on the crowd. But I really do think that there's something to this more than just that Ukrainians like sushi, or many Ukrainians like sushi. The rise of the Ukrainian love for sushi comes coincidentally around the time when the Maidan occurred. And what I would argue is that the Ukrainian collective love for sushi over time grew as a reflection of Ukraine's interests in not only opposing Russian language and culture and identity, but also trying to find a different way to connect with the West, and that's in the culinary sense as well. But that's the kind of journalism that we try to do. We've done deep reporting on Ukrainian fashion and folk fashion in Ukraine, including the wearing of vyshyvankas. I think I saw a vyshyvanka in the room somewhere earlier. We've talked about Ukrainian folk music, its traditional impact by Russian influences, and how Ukrainian artists are trying to change the future and the trajectory of Ukrainian music. What we try to do is take a different stance on what kind of journalism is interesting. I mean, one of the stories that we did this year that was really well read and shared was a story about the Ukrainian dairy industry and what it was like to smuggle Ukrainian cheese out of Ukraine during a time of war in order to take part in the World Cheese Competition. But it's stories like this, I think, that connect with people. And they connect with an audience that may not have a natural reason to be interested in Ukraine. They're stories that might be interesting to read, whether they were set in Ukraine or not. I mean, we live in a time where there's this problem of so-called Ukraine fatigue happening. That people are starting to get tired of stories that are being told from this country. What right we have to do that, I don't know. But that said, you know, there still needs to be a strategy to address it. And one of the ways to do that is to try to tell deeper stories in which people can empathize and relate to the characters that are involved in these stories. That dog looks like my dog, or that apartment looks like mine. That grandmother or grandfather looks like someone I know, or a neighbor that I might have. And so that's the philosophy that I got after a long period of reporting in Ukraine. I'd like to share with you a little bit about one of the stories that I did that led me to this philosophy. So at the end of, in 2022, one thing we really wanted to do was tell the stories of war crimes. At the time, you'll see, there were only about 50,000 alleged war crimes that had occurred in Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, there have been more than 150,000 alleged war crimes. But there's something problematic with just stating a figure or a number or a statistic. We wanted to go deep into a single case, learn about the characters involved, understand the human impact of what is happening when an atrocity occurs. And so that's how we found ourselves in this village called Novobasan. I'll tell you the genesis of this investigation that we did. I was in Dnipro, and I sat down with a researcher with Human Rights Watch. And he had done some investigations in this region, and he said he hadn't had enough time to look into this particular story, that there had been a person with ties to France who had been killed in this village called Novobasan. And he said, you should take a look at it. Why? Well, France is a really interesting connection here, because France has a concept for international law called universal jurisdiction. And what that means is that French law considers war crimes committed against French people anywhere in the world to be in the purview of its investigators and its prosecutors and its law, right? So if we could find someone in Ukraine who had been the target and subject of a war crime, it might inspire French investigators and prosecutors to explore the case more deeply. But this is the problem with investigating a war crime, is that in a time of war, as it's ongoing, it's incredibly difficult to get information. We arrived in this village called Novobasan, a very small village, about 2 hours northeast of Kyiv, with no information whatsoever about who had been killed, what had happened to that person, and who had killed him. We had no understanding whatsoever about what were the circumstances of the killing. All we knew is there was a rumor that someone with ties to France had been killed here. And it had happened, by the way, on the 4th day of the full-scale invasion. We had only gotten access to this village after it was liberated about 40 days later, 45 days later. And so this is what we saw when we arrived. It was the kind of village, there aren't that many villages like this in Canada, but in Ukraine there are plenty of villages where you can just kind of show up and you just start asking people, hey, by the way, we heard there was a French person that might have been killed here. Do you know where that is? Oh, that was just down the road. We arrived and we saw this. This is the burned out husk of a man's car. And we began to report. You can imagine it's a pretty big lift. When you're in a foreign country, there are air alarms sounding from time to time. You don't speak the language, and you've been asked to try to solve a murder, essentially. But we started canvassing the village. We learned from the mayor of the village, who had been in touch with the victim's family, that the man was a man by the name of Alexander Breas. He was 28 years old. And what we learned as we talked to his family was that he had been a former French Foreign Legionnaire. He had finished his service in France, and he'd come back to Ukraine just as the full-scale invasion had begun. One thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to express that that a war crime is not merely an act. It has reverberating and cascading effects in a community and among a family and among friends. We learned that on the day of his killing, February 28th, 2022, he had left his mother's house. That's his mother on the left. He had left his mother's house and was trying to head towards Kyiv to evacuate his fiancée and his sister and move them into Western Ukraine. But we wanted to tell the story not just of Alexander as someone who news is acted on, but an important person to learn about more himself as an individual. We learned about Alexander as a person who loved to cycle, who played basketball, and had even put out a terrible rap single, which we played on the radio. We learned about his service and his character, his kindness to animals and his closeness to friends. And this is what we started to put together. We canvassed the entire village, and we found videos that showed Alexander's body positioning after the killing. Those videos showed things that were critical, like Alexander Breus's clothing, the fact that he was in a civilian car and he didn't have a weapon. And why that's important is that a key element of what makes a war crime is the killing of a civilian who's unarmed and for whom soldiers had no reason to execute. What was clear from the evidence was that Alexander Breus was dressed in civilian clothing. He was in a blue car, not any sort of car that could be mistaken as a military vehicle, and that he had no weapon. We interviewed people methodically through the area, and what we did was we talked to people who heard the explosion and told us what time they heard the explosion that marked Alexander Breus's death. We canvassed the neighborhood, and we talked to everyone who might have been in and around that place, looking for witnesses and evidence that might be able to tell us more. We went to the local morgue, and we got the report when they finally took in Alexander Breus's body. And we took in all the evidence of trauma that the coroner was able to collect on this case. And what we found was that Alexander Breus took this particular path from his hometown of Bobrovica up in the top left there into the center of the screen, into that village called Nova Basan in the Chernihiv region. And on February 28th, what we learned was that on February 28th, he had the misfortune of entering that village just at the time when the Russian advance that was headed towards Kyiv to besiege the city, he had the misfortune of entering that village just at the same time as the first Russian column entered that village. After months and months of going back and forth to this village from Kyiv, we happened to find someone who claimed to witness the killing. He had left the village, but he happened to come back by coincidence on one of our trips to Nova Basan. This is a guy named Alexander Solod, and there's an old journalistic saying, if your mother tells you that she loves you, get a second source. We had one source in this case, but what was interesting to me and what gave us so much confidence in his particular testimony about this was that Alexander Solod was a man without a computer and without a smartphone. And the story that he told us matched perfectly with the physical evidence and the video that was taken right after Alexander Breus's death. So it gave us a lot of confidence that what he was telling us was in fact the truth. And what Alexander Solod told us was that from that window there, from his window in the village of Nova Basan, he looked outside as Russian vehicles entered his village, and he saw Alexander Breus get out of his vehicle, evidently upset that Russians were in his country. And while talking to the Russian soldiers on the street, although unarmed and in civilian clothing, someone shot him in the back of the head. One of the armored vehicles backed up, and blew a hole through the back left driver's side door of the vehicle, and it was set aflame. And unfortunately, Alexander Breus's body laid on the street there for approximately 40 days, the whole period of Russian occupation until Ukrainian forces came back in and liberated the village. But that's only part of the story. That's just the story of what happened to Alexander Breus. We still needed to investigate who did this. This video is a really very sad, this photo is a really very sad photo, and it shows Alexander Breus's mother arriving in Nova Basan on the day that that village was liberated, and her finally realizing that her son had been killed during that period. She had spent the whole month and approximately a month and a half not knowing what had happened to her son. But she recognized the vehicle, and she knew what happened. Still, we needed to figure out who did it. We were able to rule out that Ukrainian forces were involved in the killing because we talked to both the Ukrainian military and we talked to the civilians in the area. And what they said was that there were no Ukrainian troops in the area on the day of Alexander Breus's killing. They were further west towards in the direction of Kyiv, or they were elsewhere further east, but not in Nova Basan. And over a period of months, we developed sources in the SBU, the Ukrainian version of, let's say, the FBI. We developed sources in the Ukrainian military and the Prosecutor General's office. And what we did was we managed to get a list of what the Ukrainian government felt were the Russian units in the area. But our true breakthrough came as a result of a video we found from a woman who had since moved back to Kyiv and was working in a furniture store in Obolon, a neighborhood of Kyiv. She had been in Nova Basan on the day of the killing. Many people left the big cities and went to smaller villages in the very early stages of the invasion because they thought it would be safer there. What it turns out actually is that these smaller villages were the site of many atrocities that the Russians thought that they could get away with, away from the prying eyes of the press or from urban centers. What happened that day was that that furniture store worker decided she would videotape the armored vehicles that came into Nova Basan right after the killing of Alexander Breus. And this photograph, is the most critical still in that video for two reasons. One, there's that O marking in white. And what that meant at that particular time in the full-scale invasion was that these Russian vehicles were from Russia's Central Military District, a particular part of their military. And then using the silhouette of the vehicle, what we were able to do was we were able to find that it was a particular kind of vehicle called the BTR-82A. And there are obsessives out there who track which Russian units have which kind of vehicles. And this is in open source. What we were able to find is that there were only 2 units in the Central Military District that operate the BTR-82A. So we were able to find the military commander who was in charge of the units that killed Alexander Breus, as well as reduce to a very small number of just a few dozen people the folks who were in the region at the time of Alexander Breus's killing. I tell this story as a kind of case study that changed my philosophy about the kind of journalism I wanted to do and devote my time with. It's an in-depth investigation that focused on people rather than actions or what happened today. I think we're entering this strange period where I'm sure we've all had big questions about how do we trust and what do we trust when it comes to information. There's a tremendous amount of it out there, and the traditional markers of what makes reliable information is no longer worthy. I've stopped using Twitter. I won't use the other name. I've stopped using Twitter as a source for incoming information. And I think we've entered this space where virality, something that used to be an indicator, something going viral, in the news used to be an indicator of something that was important and trustworthy. Maybe more important than trustworthy, but virality used to be something that we could look at and say, well, other people think that's important, and we should think that it's important too. But given that social media algorithms are now run by people we may not trust, what is the way for us to convey important information from far away to here? Or better put, if I'm in Kyiv and I want to make sure that people still care about what's happening in Ukraine, what's the best way for me to do that? There's one thing that artificial intelligence and the rise of large language models won't be able to replace, and that is human connection. So what we tried to do is create these stories that go deeper into the people who are experiencing news, and not just state that something occurred today. I think that's the kind of journalism that creates not only a direct relationship between reader and author, but also subject and reader, that will connect in the years to come, that will become increasingly important, and also is not being done at the scale that it ought to be done right now. That's one of the things that we at the Counteroffensive want to change. And that's one of the things that our team based in Kyiv is working on every single day. We've been doing stories about many different elements of Ukraine and what it's like to actually live in a war zone. We did a story recently about the cumulative physical and psychological effects of not being able to sleep because of air alarms. I got that idea, by the way, at 3 o'clock in the morning while awake from an air alarm. We interviewed Kyiv's top sleep doctor about what it really is, what the impact over 2 years of people not feeling safe, not being able to get a single night's rest, what that adds up to over the long term. And I think we're the only news publication that covered that particular element of the lived experience of the war in Ukraine. And I think that's because we have the ability to. We have a direct relationship with our readership. From last May when we launched to now, we've managed to gain more than 60,000 subscribers, making us the #1 international news Substack. And what we do is we have that direct relationship. There's no mediator between our journalism and our audience. We push out our information by email so that people get our news stories twice a week. No algorithms involved, no censorship, no Elon Musk stepping in and saying, I don't want to promote particular stories that relate to Ukraine. And we can talk about him a little bit more in the Q&A session, which I think is coming up next if we want to. This is really important because I think that the war in Ukraine is not just about the war in Ukraine. It's about all the authoritarian governments in the world who might seek to change territories and boundaries by force, and sending a message to them that that's not acceptable. China is very much watching what the United States is doing and what Ukraine is doing to resist. We've launched a monthly supplemental issue on Taiwan, from Taiwan, because we want to show what it's like for people to resist authoritarianism all around the world. China is taking big and grave, I hope, lessons from the passage of an aid package for Ukraine this week in the US Congress. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. covering Capitol Hill. And I have to say that despite the disappointment probably of some people in this room that it took so long, it wasn't a surprise to me that, that it took so many months to cobble together a package that would finally work. But I think the key thing is that it ultimately did pass. And we can talk a little bit during the Q&A session as well about what that means for the future battlefield situation. We're entering it really feels like a different and dangerous period in the world. What happens in Ukraine has implications not only for people in the Kharkiv region, but for Americans and Canadians and all sorts of people in the West. And what we're trying to do is emphasize these human stories in an effort to get people to relate and to connect, and to take action now before there's a crisis where they're directly affected, to see themselves in the shoes of people who are going through the war, and then to respond That's what we're inspired by, and that's what we're hoping to do more about. Over the last 2 years, I've seen a big change. I think folks in Ukraine, and I'm sure a lot of folks in this room, have a sense of this from their conversations with friends they might have in Ukraine. I'm thinking in particular of a friend who, when I met him 2 years ago, I thought he studied Stoic philosophy in college, and he was a rock. He was one of those people who I thought no one could break, no one could bend. And over the last 2 years, I've seen the kind of, I'm sorry to say, the degradation in his mental condition as he's grown angrier and angrier and more upset about his friends dying and the aggravation of 2+ years of violence that's been inflicted in seemingly random ways on Ukrainian cities. And who could blame him? And who could blame him for being angry at the West, which he would point out encouraged Ukrainians to resist, said, hey, we're going to stand with you until you beat back this Russian threat. But it turns out, in the eyes of many Ukrainians, what the West really meant was, we'll support you until we get tired of it, until we get bored, until something else comes up that might take our attention away. Well, this is the purpose of the counteroffensive, our publication. This is the purpose of the kind of journalism we're trying to do, to deny folks, well, I should say, to inspire folks to continue to connect with stories of people who are going through this full-scale invasion. With that, I'm happy to take some of your questions and to talk about how it is that I ended up in Ukraine. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the battlefield situation, as well as what it's like to do war crimes investigations, or, you know, how, kind of by accident, I ended up launching a news startup in a war zone. I kind of thought I would go back to Ukraine last year and just do a little bit of journalism, but turns out now I have to be an HR manager and run staff as well. But I've been very grateful for the support of our readers. We've gotten, like I mentioned, now more than 60,000 who are supporting and paying for our work, our journalism. It's something that I never thought would be possible. And, you know, I kind of told myself that I would put my life savings into this journalism project, and if after 6 months it didn't work, I could go surfing for a year and take a sabbatical. I have not yet been able to go for that surfing sabbatical, for better or for worse. But I've been very lucky to tell some really very important and I hope compelling stories of people who are going through the war in Ukraine. So with that, I'm happy to take some of your questions.
So we have an interesting range of questions. The first one, the questioner asks, you clearly have developed a relationship with Ukrainians in a way most of us haven't. What are Ukrainians saying and feeling right now about how this war will end?
It's a really interesting and complex question. You know, sometimes people ask me, you know, what do Ukrainians think victory looks like? And if you ask 100 different Ukrainians, you'll get 100 different answers. Some might say that it's the reclaiming of all territory that had been traditionally Ukrainian. Others may say that the war really doesn't end, even if there's a ceasefire, until the end of Russian imperialism and the collapse of Russian imperial ambitions and the Russian Empire into its component parts. One Ukrainian official had a really interesting answer about what the definition of victory is, and that Ukrainian official said, "I'll know that Ukraine has won when I'm able to get on a flight in Kyiv and fly to The Hague and watch Russian officials be tried for the war crimes that they committed." So two elements there, the resumption of economic normality and accountability for the atrocities that have taken place over the last 2.5 years or so. one thing that I find really, really difficult to explain and to convey in mere writing, and there are definite limits on that, is something that we tried to do with this story on sleep, which is the absolute level of physical exhaustion. We're not just talking about bags under eyes, and we're talking, I mean, the feeling that I would want to describe is like the overstimulation of nerves, that electricity, that burning that occurs, and not just for a short period of time, but for now more than 2 years. I would say that if I had to sum it up, I would say the Ukrainians are beyond exhausted. And that's just from my conversations with folks on the civilian side. Many troops, this is one of the major challenges of Ukraine's military strategy going forward, is that many troops have been fighting now for more than 2 years, or some even since 2014. Of the folks who have been fighting for more than 2 years, you'll talk to them and they'll tell you that in some cases, the number of days off that they have had over the last 2 years are in the single digits. That is the level of fatigue. You know, I've served in the military, and one of my shortcomings as a soldier is that I didn't really understand what it was like to be tired until I joined the Army. There's a totally different dizzying level of exhaustion that comes about from military work. And these people have been bearing that burden now for more than 2 years. I'll say that until the passage of aid this week, that the overwhelming view in Kyiv had been one of deep pessimism. But now the onus is back on Ukrainians to develop a plan, to take this American aid that's been allotted to them and develop a strategy to head towards whatever vision of victory it is that they hope they can achieve.
And I'm going to ask a follow-up. Am I right that there's a difference between pessimism and, despite pessimism, do people still feel that we have no choice but to fight? I mean, the alternative is to be occupied. I mean, yeah, go down fighting then, or
yeah, I think pessimism is not an abdication of the fight, right? I think people are gloomy, and who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be in the current situation? If you go to Kharkiv, you'll spend large periods of the day without electricity. Who wouldn't be gloomy under that period? Who wouldn't be gloomy and pessimistic after your friends and family members and close ones have been injured or killed, displaced as a result of this invasion? I don't think it's a negative reflection on Ukrainians that they're gloomy and pessimistic about this current situation. But if you look at the battlefield scenario, what's happening right now is that the Russians are gearing up for a potential offensive. And again, who wouldn't be gloomy about that?
Okay, we have a question about the collection of evidence of war crimes. Besides your organization, who are the players on the ground collecting the evidence, establishing war crimes, and what does the future hold in bringing these crimes to justice?
One of the major reasons we did this war crimes investigation was we wanted to show how difficult it was to investigate these cases. There are now more than 150,000 cases. It took me 10 months to do a single case, and we didn't ultimately charge anyone. Right? We didn't have to. We were operating from journalistic, not prosecutorial standards. Another big challenge for accountability is that Ukrainian prosecutors were not trained in war crimes investigations and prosecutions. There's now a huge effort underway by Western prosecutors who had experience in Bosnia and other places in the world where war crimes have occurred to go into Ukraine and train Ukrainian investigators to give them a sense of knowledge about this is how you conduct these sorts of investigations, this is how you protect people, and this is how you accumulate evidence in a way that will eventually be able to bring some people to accountability for the actions. There are two elements of war crimes. There are two different kinds of war crimes. In Ukraine, the domestic criminal code outlaws war crimes. And so it's a crime under Ukrainian statutes to commit the killing of Alexander Breus, as we've seen in that case study I presented earlier. But there's also a set of treaties and laws and international obligations that make up international law, ultimately leading to the International Criminal Court. But history has shown that when it comes to international law, often might makes right, that people who are prosecuted for war crimes are ultimately only prosecuted when they're in a very vulnerable situation, when they no longer have power or they're no longer in high office. So I think that every single case counts, that every story that sheds some light on both the perpetrator of war crimes and the victims families and loved ones counts and brings us towards justice. There are many different kinds of justice, one of which is criminal, and others are simply an accounting of what happened. But I think the short answer is that the terrible reality of the scale of Russian war crimes means that for the vast majority of cases, there will never be justice in any sense, because evidence cannot be collected, or the legal systems, the international structures that are supposed to ensure accountability for war crimes won't be able to do their jobs or will choose not to do their jobs. And that many people, particularly at the mid-level and at the perpetrator level, won't be held accountable for their actions.
And the question also was about what are the organizations, the players in collecting evidence? You mentioned that this case came to you through, was it Human Rights Watch?
Human Rights Watch, yeah.
What are the others?
There are many NGOs, both Ukrainian and international, that are working on this particular issue. One of the Ukrainian organizations is called Truth Hounds, and what they do is they do open source intelligence and investigations into what's happening in Ukraine. One of the really difficult things about the war crime situation is that criminal investigations are typically opened at the local level in Ukraine. And so what that means is that local investigators funnel cases towards national prosecutors. Once again, the problem is that local prosecutors and investigators, they're not trained to do war crimes investigations. And they're so overwhelmed by the scale. I mean, you talk to some of these war crimes investigators, and they are working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to put together cases. But there are not enough investigators and not enough prosecutors to be able to take a look at the scale. You just think about a relatively simple murder case that would happen here in Toronto, and the number of hours that people would need to spend in order to collect the evidence and create a prosecution for that case. Now multiply that by 150,000 potential cases. And so, yes, there's, unfortunately, the scale of it is such that in each individual case, it's unlikely that there'll be accountability. The hope is, in the long term, that more senior officials who are responsible for the war crimes that were prosecuted, prosecuted by the Russian military, that they will be held accountable at some point.
One can hope. Okay, this person begins, Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. Thank you so much for your work. What was the most difficult aspect of this war crime investigation? More broadly, what are the biggest challenges of being based in and operating from an active war zone? And third question, how are the Philadelphia rules in Kiev? So the question is about...
I'll take them in turn.
The most difficult aspect of this investigation.
So I'm a former U.S. Army combat medic. And so, as you may guess, blood doesn't particularly bother me, and images of gore aren't especially upsetting to me. The things that really I remember is taking on the grief from people who have experienced a loss which very few people in the world will ever experience. the death of a child in this case, in Alexander Breus's case. I've written quite intimately about my experiences with developing post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of my reporting in Ukraine. Actually, in December of 2022, I left Ukraine thinking, I'm not going back. I think I've had enough. And had to seek treatment for PTSD, in part because of this particular case, in which I not only investigated a war crime, but went very deep into the family members and loved ones who cared about Alexander Breus. And beyond that, was witness to a number of videos and photos which were hard to forget. I am reluctant to remind you of the fact that Alexander Breus's body laid out in the street for 40 days. And any investigation of that killing needed a close and repeated watching of all the evidence, including morgue reports, relevant photos, and videos of all of the above, right? And so that, in the context of an already extremely stressful period, in which I was getting almost no sleep and trying to report news of the war on top of a war crimes investigation on which I felt a lot depended, and particularly, the family's hopes depended, that led to a lot of strain, but also a lot of understanding and knowledge and learning about my own limits and what war can do psychologically to me. Someone who, I had entered it maybe with a little bit too much swagger, having been in the military and having seen a fair amount of things, and thinking that it would just be more of that.
So you went back in December thinking maybe you weren't going to return?
I told all my friends, hey, you don't have to worry about me, I'm not going back.
And then how long was it before you thought, I'm going back?
Yeah, in May, 5 months later, I moved to Ukraine permanently, and I live there now.
5 months.
I think my friends who, I told, hey, I'm not going back, they did wonder, hey, didn't you tell me you were never going back to that place? But as time went on and after I sought treatment, I realized that the war was still going on and I could not be part of continuing to try to tell that story.
I'm going to group these three and then you can answer them.
Oh, I didn't answer the Philadelphia role question.
Okay, give it to us.
Look, I love Ukrainians, so I want to preface my statement on this. But the typical Ukrainian treatment of sushi not only involves a lot of cream cheese, but essentially a boat of soy sauce in which they smother the sushi into and then eat with soy sauce dripping off the sushi. As you can tell by my speech, I'm very pro-Ukrainian, but I can't endorse that.
Okay, the next three are about the impact of how Ukraine is or isn't armed. And I'll read all three. One question is, in light of the second Trump presidency, do you think Europe will be able to fill the void and have, with the capacity to provide enough military support to Ukraine if Trump wins? Can Europe fill the void? Next question, tactical weapons from the West have strategic impact. Why has it been so slow when it's so clear that they're important? And then more broadly, why was the Ukrainian 2023 offensive unsuccessful? So. Okay.
The unfortunate fact of European assistance is that it's not anywhere near sufficient. I think there's one statistic that sums it all up for our consideration, which is that over the course of this war, South Korea has sent more artillery shells indirectly to Ukraine than the entirety of Europe, the continent on which this war is happening. That is a huge problem and an abdication of responsibility among European leaders who have not been sufficiently pressured into doing what's necessary for European security. So if Trump is elected for a second term, do not count on the Europeans to step up. I haven't seen any indication that they're willing to hold a press conference saying we're going to send the shells. They're not willing to actually do the hard work of setting up logistics chains to send the shells. And they're also in a position where, unlike the United States, they haven't created a robust manufacturing industry of sufficient weapons that would be useful in this conflict. They're not only behind in the manufacturing of shells, but all sorts of other important weapon systems that would be necessary for the conduct of war. To answer the second to segue into the second question regarding weapons, right now we're entering this phase of warfare in which the old ways of conducting combat are quickly being phased out and becoming no longer relevant. There's a real-time development of drone technology in Ukraine that is so fast and so complex that by the time, I've talked to many drone manufacturers in Ukraine, and they say that well-meaning Western companies will send them drones, but by the time the newly made drones in the West are sent from the West to Ukraine, they're obsolete. There's this incredible innovation that's happening as a result of the fighting that's happening there. Crazy. I can get into more detail into this if you want. But things like Ukrainian drone automation in which no humans are in the loop of the kill cycle. It creates incredible questions about morality, ethics, law, and technology that we haven't really grappled with fully. But the kinds of weapons that will matter are weapons related to how to make these $500 drones more effective, fly further, less jammable, and then on the flip side, on counter-drone technology, how to jam them more effectively, how to prevent them from coming and striking our targets.
We have two questions here about misinformation. What specific actions? One of the questions is what can the Ukrainian diaspora do to counter the misinformed? But it's true for anyone who wants to counter the misinformation. And they mention in particular in the ranks of the House Republicans and the MAGA arm. And the other question is how do we counter Russian misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies?
Well, I wouldn't be a good founder of a company if I didn't mention that you should read The Counteroffensive at www.counteroffensive.news. This problem of Russian disinformation has existed long before the full-scale invasion and will exist long after. And one of the main ways to combat it is to to understand who are the people susceptible to Russian disinformation, and also what are the good sources of information. I talked a little bit during my remarks about how social media has become quite a poor source of information nowadays. But who are the publications, or which are the publications that you've developed a relationship of trust with, that you've understood when they're wrong, will acknowledge their mistakes and try to correct them? And who, over a period of time, months and years, you've understood have told you the truth repeatedly over and over and again, and developed a reputation for that. And on a personal level, are we being curious enough? Are we, I think each of us, whether well-intentioned or not, can be susceptible to disinformation purely because the information that's being provided to us confirms our pre-existing opinions and biases. Are we asking the hard questions even of people that we typically agree with? And are we diversifying our sources of information such that we are taking in, well, like I said earlier, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source. Are we being skeptical and curious and demanding? One of the great things, as I was saying during my remarks about Substack, is that we have this direct relationship with our readers. There's no algorithm between us and them, and we're able to tell our stories of what's happening in Ukraine in unprecedented ways. We would not have been able to do this probably 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. But we've been able to do this and create a publication because we have this, we've kind of eliminated the mediators and folks who would have been gatekeepers in the past.
We have two interesting questions about race and Ukraine. The first, you spoke about creating human connection in journalism through reporting on stories that allow people to connect to people like them. Can you speak about racism you've seen from reporters related to Ukrainians who look like us, as opposed to migrant refugees from other conflict areas? And then someone else mentions having been at the Monk School and seeing an African-American journalist, probably of Terrell Star, who has also worked in Ukraine. If it's relevant, would you care to comment on being Asian Canadian American during the war in Ukraine? And I guess it connects to stories that help people connect to seeing people, that people are like them, even if they don't seem like them surfacely. Or...
I was walking down the street in Dnipro, and someone yelled "ni hao" at me. And in America, those are fighting words. In Canada, those are fighting words. My fists clenched up, my blood pressure arose, and I turned around ready for some sort of racist confrontation. And I turned around in Dnipro, and it was a Chinese person who only spoke Chinese saying hello. The thing is that there was also another case where a Ukrainian child ran up, pointed at me and said, "Oh my God," and then ran away. But those are really the only two incidents that I can think of. The thing is that, I've spent much of my adult life in America where race is the defining identity, the defining factor of how people are treated and where stereotypes reside and where prejudices lie. And what I found in Ukraine is that that race is a much less important issue. I don't really feel, obviously I'm as Asian today as I was yesterday, but I don't really feel defined by that particular characteristic of my identity in Ukraine. And it doesn't seem like, maybe, for example, there are not sufficient stereotypes about Asians in Ukraine for them to apply any stereotypes about who I am or what I might be. But in Ukraine, in a very liberating way, I felt able to form my own identity, my own, people don't make presumptions about of who I am or where I'm from or what I might do in ways that people might do in the United States, for example. Almost no one in the United States looks at me and says, well, there's a war correspondent, former combat medic. I don't know why that is, or why people might make certain presumptions about me based on the way I look. That, that's a longer conversation. But in Ukraine, I feel when I explain who I am, people say, huh, that figures.
The first thing they notice about you is that you're a foreigner. It's not.
It's a very freeing and strange space for me to be in, to not be identified by my Asian ethnicity, because almost everywhere else in the world I am. I'm categorized as a foreigner in kind of a nebulous way, and it's been very unique and strange to feel that way.
Now, someone wants to know, when air raid alarms go off, where do you go? And they continue, please describe day-to-day life for you in Kyiv.
The great thing about journalism is that there is no typical day. It's one of the great things about that field, is that there is no day where you can know exactly where you are, or where you'll be, or who you'll talk to. The news is an incredibly dynamic industry, and it changes and it flows. When it comes,
are you traveling a lot?
Traveling quite a bit. But this is why I think war correspondence is the most expensive kind of journalism that can be done, right? So the war crimes case study that I did, that was done under the auspices of a very, very large American news organization. It probably cost well into the six figures to do an investigation that took 10 months and many different people, interpreters, security people, fuel, food, lodging, to get that investigation done. And you know, what our readers and subscribers who pay for our journalism, what they've been able to do is they've paid for our body armor and our fuel and our car and our gas station hot dogs, I'm sad to say. When it comes to error alerts, one thing that's been really interesting is the proliferation of really detailed information about the kinds of missiles, rockets, or drones that might be headed to different areas. That if you monitor drone channels, you'll understand kind of the scale of the alert. Not every error alert is the same. And if you look down at your phone and you see a massive strike happening all across Ukraine, you do pretty well to go downstairs, you know. I happen to live in the center of Kyiv on the 11th floor, which is not far from where the Zelensky administration building is, which is one of the most heavily protected areas of Kyiv, but also probably one of the areas which the Putin's regime would very much like to strike the most. And so it really is a case-by-case basis. You'll go downstairs sometimes when you see a very, very big attack incoming, or you might go into a kind of central room where there's a rule that you want to have at least 2 walls between you and the outside in order to be in a safer position. And so it's a case-by-case situation.
I think we can get through all the questions if you can be relatively succinct.
Okay, I'll try.
We can get through them. Okay, Alexander Romanko asks, while we know how to use AI algorithms for investigations like the Bellingcat model, can we utilize them to develop narratives that resonate with people and encourage empathy in the audience with an eye toward helping Ukraine to win? So using AI, developing narratives that resonate with people.
I don't think so. I don't think AI, I think one of the things that AI will fail to achieve in the long term is to be able to have a conversation like you and I and develop trust. One of the most challenging things about journalism is to try to see who it is that you're sitting across from and what are the things, putting yourself in their shoes and trying to develop a strategy to get them to talk about things that maybe sometimes they don't want to talk about. One story, I've been doing a lot of lecturing recently with journalism students, and one story that I've been telling about is how I managed to get some of the sources that I did in the book that I wrote about the National Rifle Association, an organization which is notorious for being unfriendly towards journalists. In one case, I won't out the particular person, but let's call him John Smith. A person named John Smith declined my very kindly written request to interview him for the National Rifle Association book. So what I did was I developed a strategy by looking up all the people who had filed lawsuits against John Smith and interviewing all of them. And then going back to John and saying, look, I've talked to Mary and Jane and Joe, and they don't have a lot of great things to say about you. But maybe in the interest of fairness, we could get a cup of coffee and you could tell me your side of the story. That doesn't work for everyone. That's not a formula to get someone to talk. That's an assessment that I made based on my assumptions on this particular person's pride, ego, and interest in telling his side of the story and not having his story told by people he disliked. I tell this long roundabout way, this long roundabout answer to a question about artificial intelligence, and by saying that artificial intelligence is a great median answer. It's a great response when you want content. But when you want connection and you want to relate to another human being, understand that person, I'm going to find it hard to believe that computers can do that in my lifetime. And I also would put the asterisk that it's kind of in my best interest to argue this, because if AI were to be able to do this, I'd be very quickly out of a job.
We have a question here. To what extent do you see NATO support in Ukraine in terms of weapons, money, the sanctions working against Russia, I guess? Naval support, military, army support?
NATO support, you said? NATO support. Yeah, I think that even many Ukrainians who are upset about the reluctance of Western and American support to come in until very recently with the United States would acknowledge that Ukraine wouldn't have made the gains that it's had to date without NATO support. That very early on in the war, simple things like Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles, were critical to Kyiv remaining in Ukrainian hands, were critical to winning that initial battle. You see not only, I think it's not only NATO equipment, but it's also NATO intelligence and NATO training that have been really very critical for Ukrainian success to the extent that it's occurred so far. You know, the United States and Ukraine had developed very, very deep intelligence sharing agreements and methods so that they can share information about what's incoming. And I think without that, the Ukrainian military would be very much not performing as well as it has been.
This question is about Ukrainians who've gone to the West. Do you sense or hear animosity towards Ukrainians who've gone abroad to the West?
This is like the question on victory too, right? That you ask 100 Ukrainians, you'll get 100 different answers. Actually, I'm thinking about conducting a poll in Ukraine. Maybe I'll ask this question. We're doing a story shortly about male attitudes in Ukraine. I think that there's a particular resentment against young Ukrainian men who are not in Ukraine. There's, as many of you may know, there is a law prohibiting military-age males from leaving the country. So Ukrainian citizen males who have found a way to leave and decided not to go back, I sense that there will be a not particularly warm welcome if and when they do return. For many Ukrainians, the question will be for a generation, what did you do when this invasion occurred? I suspect that any person who left the country during this period, would be pretty much disqualified for public office, or not in a formal sense, but in the sense of public opinion. There have been so much sacrifice and so much grief and so much suffering, and I think it's a fair question to ask. Where were you and what did you do during this period?
There's a question about Elon Musk. It says, will he stop? Is there anything you want to say about Elon Musk?
Well, we did a story about, we try to have a novel and creative way to do each of our stories, as I hope you've understood through the different examples that we've done. We did a story about the Church of St. Elon in Kyiv. Ukrainians have a way of, Ukrainians have a particular style of art in which they sometimes take individuals and they lionize them in an Orthodox Christianity drawing style.
Like an icon. Like
an icon, yeah. And there was a Tesla dealership in Kyiv, which marked itself as the Church of St. Elon in the Oblon neighborhood. And we went there and we interviewed the owner and we interviewed people coming down, up and down the street. Actually, after our story was published, they insisted that they were changing the name of the of the Church of St. Elon, and they actually took down the icon glorifying Elon Musk. I don't know if Elon will stop, but I know that they'll stop calling that particular place the Church of St. Elon.
There's a question about PTSD and what builds, how can you build resilience in a war zone? And are there people who actually do well in a war zone?
Yes. Well, so after I developed PTSD and started to recover, what I really wanted to do, and when I went back to Ukraine, I was making plans to go back to Ukraine last May. And ahead of that, I started doing, I guess, what's natural to me, which is I started trying to report out that question. I wanted to understand, what makes resilience against PTSD? How can I develop it? There are a couple factors. that are critical, according to doctors who study the space. One of which is not resisting your natural feelings and responses to a traumatic event. And it's having as many conversations as you feel is necessary in order to share what happened to you. But a critical component to that, and it's kind of supplementary to that first point, is social support. Being surrounded by loved ones and people who care about you and your friends and folks who you can be frank and honest, intimate and vulnerable with, and have those conversations about what happened. One of the really interesting things about the lower incidence of PTSD after World War II as compared to the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the soldiers that had gone through arguably more difficult conditions than the modern warfare experience, as they returned home largely on naval vessels that took a week, 2 weeks to transit from Europe to the United States. And during that time, they were able to be surrounded by the people who they had endured these terrible things with, to debrief and to have conversations and to share what frightened them and what angered them, what shocked them, and what traumatized them, in the typical way that people do, maybe not in the most vulnerable senses of things, but they were able to debrief in a way that a modern soldier is not able to. Many soldiers, they'll be in Iraq during this period of the global war on terror. They'd be in Iraq and Afghanistan one day, 36 hours, they'd be in a small town in Indiana with no connection to the troops and their colleagues who they'd gone through this very horrific and difficult experience with, alone without anyone who might understand. And so that's a long way of saying that social support is absolutely the primary way. There are genetic and social indicators for resilience to PTSD, but it's hard to know what they are exactly. And it's hard to know until you've gone through it yourself.
And I think this is an appropriate question to end with. I saved it. Thank you for your work on reporting the war in Ukraine. What's next for Tim Mack?
I don't know. I think that I will continue to report as long as folks like people in this room are willing to read me and subscribe and take a look at the kind of interesting journalism I hope that we're continuing. It's a real passion of mine to mentor and teach Ukrainian reporters that we're teaching now to write in English and talk to a Western audience about important human interest stories. I'm going to keep doing that. We've launched the Taiwan supplemental monthly issue in which we do what we're doing in Ukraine, but also from a Taiwanese perspective. There are so many interesting parallels between the Ukrainian experience and the Taiwanese experience, two smaller countries that are facing off against an authoritarian neighbor and wanting to push back. The Maidan and the Sunflower Revolution, that happened in Taiwan, they happened in 2014 around the same time and for similar reasons, against trade compacts that had been agreed to by the government, which they wanted to resist. And there are so many Taiwanese that take inspiration from the Ukrainian experience and relationships that have developed in the time since the full-scale invasion has begun. I wonder if maybe there isn't room for me to launch another publication at some point about human stories and using the philosophy that we've developed in Ukraine and telling stories of the U.S.-Mexico border and what might be happening there. You might look for us to perhaps launch something in that vein in the next year or so, particularly if there's more interest in it, and particularly if news develops in a certain way. I mean, I think that one really alarming thing about the presidential election is that it's become mainstream Republican thinking that that an appropriate foreign policy agenda item would be to launch attacks into Mexico if Trump were to be elected for a second term. That's a mainstream idea, not only for Donald Trump and his advisors, but among many of the mainstream candidates, including DeSantis and Nikki Haley. And so if Donald Trump is elected, we can expect an already difficult world to perhaps get a little bit more difficult. but I guess one step at a time. I'm not going to leave Ukraine as long as I have the means to continue telling those stories of what's happening to the people there and to try to apply our unique journalistic style to cut through this problem of Ukraine fatigue.
We've gotten through the questions. It's 8:30, and I think there's some concluding remarks.